So what is economics? We at Well-Being Economics we take a very heterodox view of what economics is, and generally speaking, the common argument you hear about what economics is that it's an allocation of resources, and we tweak that a little bit and argue that economics is the social creation and social distribution of goods, and that creates a new story, because at the end, economics is still a story of people, a story of human beings, and a story of narratives and different perspectives, and who gets what, and what things are produced and so on, and how are they distributed. So that's the main thing that we take from economics. How is it distributed? When you look at this, so many things that come into mind that are part of that social story. So homelessness, poverty, climate crisis. A stat I read the other day about homelessness was that about 11,000 people who are off sleeping in London, and there's about 30,000 empty homes from investments and these real estate situations. And once you learn economics, the politics changes and you see politics in a different way. It becomes less about utopian demands and it becomes more about human demands, about material goods. If we're going to invest in people, if we're going to invest in, give people homes, or we're going to allow fake Trumps and a bunch of fake real estate agents to invest in, to turn profit over and create problems. So these are pretty much the main things that we think once you reconsider, once you bear economics in mind, you reconsider these things. These are the main things. I hope you guys can see it. So, how much income people have, homelessness, development, innovation, and so on. Free market started and mercantilism became the main method of production, the main method of distribution. Free markets economics became the main method of interpreting the world that we live in. And Adam Smith basically understood things as, his main quote that we often use is that it's not the benevolence of the butcher that causes him to offer his goods, it's his rational self-interest. And so rational self-interest is the first thing that we center in Adam Smith's theory. Sorry, my handwriting is a bit off. Tell me if you don't see anything. Also, if you guys want to ask any question during these lectures, you can go onto our Instagram page. We have a Padlet, a link to it if you feel uncomfortable. I'm sure we can all speak as well. We're all here, but we have more people attending. So the rational self-interest, and two other things that he pointed out that he critiqued the rentier class. In his Wealth of Nations, he critiqued the feudal old classes who benefited and profited of interest of land, of owning assets rather than reinvesting in assets. They were the usurious, or you can just call them. I'll focus more on the interests of assets, and he critiqued them as a class that didn't invest in production and didn't invest in new goods and so on and circulate the money around. And that was the main issue he had. And the third issue that he also pointed out, that we think is important to point out, is self-interest, interest of assets, and to be honest, I think that's pretty much the main thing that I think is worth looking at. Because I was trying to speed up. Yeah, sure. I'm making it really slow. But Adam Smith points out these two things. And you have to bear in mind to look into economics. But then this created the different perspectives on how we can see things and different tendencies that come about when later on when I'm talking. It will come about. It will make more sense. It will materialize. So John Baptiste say is a classical economist who took his ideas forward and basically builds the basis for the classical form of economics and the classical form of free market economics. And his main thing was called Say's law, which is basically that supply creates demand. That demand is determined by the amount of supply. And it's argued that the supply of a good supplies the demand for another good. So if that makes sense, that supply in itself creates demand for another supply. So his basis was a bartering economy. He understood the capitalist economy as a barter economy where we traded goods with each other. And it was a supply meets supply situation. So demand was completely, taken out of the circulation, the situation, if that makes sense. So that was Say's law. And the main critique that came about against it was Karl Marx. My handwriting is really terrible. Karl Marx. And the one thing I want to mention about Baptista's law is that it's based on the formula of CMC, which is basically that commodities are used with the medium of money to invest in, to either consume or invest in capital. But there's two C's are consumption and commodities, and money is just the medium of exchange between the two. And
we'll be going into that in detail later on.
Alright, you're right, true. I just want to say that early so we can compare it to Marx. What Marx changed was to focus on MCM. And that's the first critique of Say's law that really, brought some things into question. Because basically, rather than investment coming back into supply, and supply making constantly maintaining circulation, a situation where money was used to reproduce more money. And money itself became the necessity and the need to invest in goods. So it became a situation where most firms and most capitalists were short-circuited and invest in financial assets because they wanted to, and we have this problem right now with financial crash and so on, and financialization of things. But at least on the basis, on the basic level, it argues that there's no Say's law. We don't supply in order to just trade with goods. At the end of it, there's money that holds a value in its own, and it's used for future purchases. So that's the first contradictions within the argument. You can see obviously the interest of assets comes into the situation. And so Friedman is then another person. I'll put on this side so you can understand the different perspectives. Noticing Friedman argued that he argued mainly for monetary policy, interest rates, controlling interest rates as a means of controlling the economy, controlling the money supply. But to understand him, you have to first compare him to Keynes. Because he came in the 60s. And so the main idea right now is that Marx came about in the 1860s and argued against Say's law and argued against capitalist norms in order to argue that the politics that we should focus on is the politics where the proletariat, the class that produces the goods, are conscious of their actions and are self-conscious of what happens. Because if they're conscious of the economy, they're conscious of politics around them, and then they can produce more, thank you. And they can control, they can at least understand their role in the overall economy and the overall whole of things. So Karl Marx critiques Say, and then the problem was that when the 1930s came, the neoclassical economics taken over the norms of economics, and they pushed for free market policy and demand and supply, and mainly Say's law. So we had a situation where there was high unemployment, the depression was happening, and the main economists argued at the time that they should lower wages. This is before Keynes comes in, but I'm giving the foreground to Keynes. So you should lower wages. So if they lowered wages, then capitalists would lower prices because the goods, the idea was that wages, the idea is it's called marginal cost of labor. And is that labor reaches an equilibrium. And according to the demand supply and all the Say's law in relation to labor, if there's an equilibrium, the marginal cost of labor, it means that any extra worker that's hired will create a cost, and will create extra costs. So we've reached the point of full employment. That's what they argued during the Depression, that they should lower wages, because if we already have full employment, we should lower wages so that prices would go down, and then it would cause people to buy the goods, and they would hire more workers. So that was the solution for the Depression, but it caused a spiral, and it caused more unemployment. And then Keynes came in, and Keynes argued that the main phrase that he used was that firms hire labor that they think they'll need to create the output that they think will get them a profit. So because it was only based off outputs that could get them a profit. So that was the main thing that labor was around. And if labor wasn't paid enough, there was no way that they could buy any of the goods. So Keynes argued for more demand side policies and fiscal policies, which is when the government spends money into the economy. And so the fiscal policies were to rejuvenate the economy and to cause more demand in the economy and to buy more goods. But then Milton Friedman came in the 60s. So this is when we had the 1930s, post-war social democracy, we had trade unions, we had all the kind of, full employment, we had full jobs, worthwhile jobs and so on. Right before the 1960s, Milton Friedman came in and he argued that stagflation came about because there was a trick against the workers had been tricked and they understand real wages, how real wages operated, because they just knew nominal wages and they just knew nominal wages were increasing. So to them, whenever they found out real wages, they would ask for higher wages and it would create stagflation, and inflation would rise with wages. But then, so stagflation. But then what they didn't bear in mind was that, he said stagflation, his solution was to have interest rates. But then the entire argument around interest rates is loanable funds theory, which is basically the idea that funds that are used to invest in goods come from savings. And it's a situation between savings equals investment in the economy. And the government spending is usually a thing that stands in the way. It takes out from savings and it takes out from investment, takes away from investment. So we said that savings with government spending is G plus, let's take away.
Okay, we'll explain that one in detail.
Okay, yeah, I don't want to,
I think I'll take over and then
right, so
he gave an overview, that's good.
Yeah.
Okay, so if you guys didn't fully follow that, that's okay, because I'm going to go into detail in every single one of these points. Thanks, Goju. That was a nice intro of the four main economists. Wait, what are focus on?
Just check the PowerPoint where you want it. I put it for, I think, the slide.
Yeah, okay. So I'm going to start with a very mainstream model, and we teach this in every economics course. You got households, and you got firms. Households work for firms to supply labor. Firms sell to households, they give them goods and services. So you go to the firm to build things which you then consume. It goes in a circle. Now, in exchange for labor, households get wages. And in exchange for goods, firms get profit. And that's how the economy works. It goes in a circle. Remember, wages and profit, they're the money. That's what we are interested in. Where do households get their money from? Well, they get it from firms. Where do firms get their money from? Well, they get it from profit. But there's a problem with this. It goes in a circle. Where did it all start? Where did it all start? It had to have come from outside the system. Otherwise, you're in an infinite regress. And if anyone studied philosophy here, you cannot have infinite regresses, at least in human societies, that's for sure. So it has to have come in the form of an injection. Now, where does money come from? What about G? If I were to make a £5 note, I would get arrested for counterfeiting it. I do not have the authority to issue money, government money. Now, there are other sources of money. One is exports, call it X. And the other one's investment. And we'll get into that later. So notice how the government has to spend money to create this economy, and then that money can be taxed out. That money can also be saved, and that money can be used to buy imports. So injections come before leakages. This is going completely against what the mainstream teaches in every econ course, because they think, this is the popular myth, you need tax money in order to spend, right? The government needs to collect tax money, and it gets the income, but it needs to spend in the economy. It's completely false. The government spends first, and then it can tax. And the implications of this are wild, because it means the government can never run out of money, because it has the sole issuing authority of spending the currency. It can spend as much as it likes. Theoretically, if the government wants to, it could credit us all £1 trillion. It wouldn't be a good idea, but they could do that if they wanted to. So what does taxation do? Taxation just deletes money. That's all it does. It just takes money out of the system. It just deletes it, wipes it away. Now, so everyone good with that so far, right? Understandable? Right. This is the logical sequence. So remember, the mainstream neoclassical idea is that governments has tax money to spend. If it spends more than it taxes, it has to borrow the money from someone. Borrow it from the banks or from China or from whoever. I mean, think about this. Why would the UK want to borrow pounds from China of all places? Do they issue pounds? They got them from us. And if you borrow too much, that causes interest rates to shoot up, and then you end up getting hyperinflation, you turn into Zimbabwe. And then Margaret Thatcher quote down, the problem with socialism is that eventually you run out of other people's money. It's complete nonsense. And logically it's inescapable. The money has to be created, it has to be spent into existence before it can possibly be taxed. And this is where the concept of a currency issuer versus a currency user comes in. Now, currency user is me, you, firms, local governments. They all have to earn money to spend. Well, the currency user is the central government, or the federal government in the US. These guys do not need to earn tax revenue to spend. They spend first before they tax. So whenever a government spends, it just credits your bank account with reserves, and that's it. That's it. It's done. They don't collect it from anywhere. They don't borrow it. Think of it as an analogy of a scorekeeper. I'm at a football game and I'm keeping track of which team is scoring a goal. And let's say a team scores a goal, and I award them a point, and then somebody says, wait, hold on. Don't you have to get that point from somewhere? Don't you have to tax the point? Don't you have to borrow the point with interest? What are you talking about? Just make it up. And that's exactly what money is. You just make it up. Now, I'll give a historical example. So, the French in 1904, they went down to Madagascar to colonize it. And what we see there is a society that was non-monetary. So the African people who were living in Madagascar, they did not have capitalism, right? They lived in their huts, they made food for themselves, it was communal kind of lifestyle. And there were many other economic systems like that. So for most of human history, we were like hunter-gatherers. We had feudal societies, we had slave societies, we had communal societies. And that's what they were. And notice, in any other society except a capitalist one, there is no unemployment. The definition of unemployment is a person, or people, willing and able to work for the currency, in other words, a wage. true. It's wage labor. It's not, unemployment is not when I want to go to volunteer at the British Heart Foundation or some other charitable work. Unemployment is when you need a wage. Not volunteering, not slavery, not feudal obligations. It's wage labor. It's a distinctly capitalist concept. There was no unemployment in hunter-gatherer societies. There was no unemployment in Native American societies. Money is the cause of unemployment. So anyway, back to the French example. When the French went into Madagascar in 1905, there was no unemployment amongst the people that they went to colonize. So what the French government wanted is they wanted those people to work for the government. They wanted to make them unemployed. But this is what they did. They had huts, the people who lived there. What the government did is they put a tax liability on the hut. A tax liability is an obligation to pay tax. Think of a property tax. Let's say you have to pay £200 on your house. If they don't pay the tax liability, if they don't pay like let's say 100 French francs, I don't know what the symbol for French francs is, but let's say it's a 100 squiggly thing. If they don't pay 100, their house gets burned down. The same applies for today. If you don't pay your property tax, you can get fined. If you don't pay the fines, you could get your house taken away from you. And you might even face jail time if you don't pay your taxes. It's a crime. So now, before the currency was useless, why do we accept something that the government can just make, they can just print an infinite amount of? Well, the reason is we have to pay our taxes. If you don't pay your tax, your hut gets burned down. Or some form of punishment will happen if you don't pay your tax. So now, once they put a property tax in everyone's house, everyone in that society became unemployed. We suddenly have 100% unemployment. Now they have to earn the French currency in order to keep the hut. So that's how they ended working for the government. The French government had all these African people working for them because they needed to earn the money from the government to pay the tax. So let's say the government hires like 25% of them. That still leaves 75% unemployed. So as we can see, unemployment was created by the government. It's a government choice. It's a political choice. A lot of free market people will say, well, unemployment is natural. There's nothing you can do about it. It's a natural rate, as Quaker mentioned Milton Friedman. He thought there was a natural rate of unemployment. Well, as we can see, not really. It's a government invention. It's a political choice. We could eliminate the unemployment. Either we could hire all these people, so we'll have a 100% government economy. Some people would think that's a good idea, others might not. But we could lower the taxes, so people have more income to spend, create employment, or we could increase spending generally to the economy. The size of a government is also just a political choice. So like in America, they have like 20%, it's small government. France, they have like 50%, so they have a much larger one. So, everyone following so far?
The definition of unemployment, is that the full definition?
Oh, shit. But they can't find a job, yes. Yeah, so you're willing and able to work for a wage, but you cannot find a job. That's unemployment. Thanks for pointing that out. So, in summary, the sequence is not from tax to spend. It's tax liability, then spending, and then the tax. And I'll give you a quick example. So if the government pays you welfare payments, what they do is there's your bank, and there's the government. What the government does is just credits your bank's, let's say you get £100 in welfare, your bank's reserves go up by 100, and your bank deposit also goes up by 100. And taxation would just be the reverse of this. So here it was plus 100, plus, and here it would just be, let's say you pay £80 in tax. It's just minus £80 in reserves. minus £80 in your deposit. Here they credit your deposit, here they debit your deposit. Debit means go down, credit means go up. So that's how spending works. We didn't collect that anywhere, they didn't borrow it from anyone, we just made it up. It's numbers on a screen. Money is not finite. So, you know, David Cameron, when he was elected, he had this big austerity program. We need to tighten our belts, we need to pay back the national debt. All these silly things. It doesn't apply. It applies to us. I have to tighten my belt, otherwise I'll go broke. But the government does not. They're not like households. What the mainstream is, they make this false analogy. They say governments are like households. They have to be frugal. Now, this is my opinion. This is fact. We can have Alan Greenspan, a very right-wing guy. He's a big fan of Milton Friedman, who we mentioned. He is an Ayn Rand fan. He's way off the political spectrum compared to me. And he admits this. I don't think we'll have time to go over the video.
If we've got time at the end, we could.
Towards the end, we'll go over it. And he admits this. You know,
He was also the chairman of the Federal Reserve.
he was the chairman of the Federal Reserve. So he was overseeing all of this. So don't take my word for it, take his word. And every central bank admits this. They all release papers saying, but the way the textbooks teach is completely and utterly false. Ben Bernanke, same thing. He was the chairman of the Federal Reserve after Greenspan.
Yeah, he said the same thing, didn't he? Just the same words.
So what is borrowing when government borrows? So when they say the government's borrowing, clearly it's wrong, right? There's no such thing as government borrowing. So can anyone describe what borrowing really is with this in mind now? Anyone? Just a guess, come on.
I guess it's just like taking back. It's like the government taking back what's given out.
Yeah, that's actually pretty good. What government borrowing really is. So remember when I said they credit your bank, that they make a welfare payment, let's say welfare payment. They credit your bank reserves by 100 and your bank credits your deposit by 100. What borrowing does is basically the issuance of a bond. Banks hold reserves, but they also hold bonds. So when the government borrows, it gives the bank a bond instead of reserves. So instead of 100 in reserves, we'll use, let's say, 80, so we have 20 left, to buy bonds. So then they have £80 in their bond account and only £20 in their reserves. Bonds drain reserves. So what is a bond? Bond is like a savings account at the central bank. Like I have a bank account at my bank, your bank has a bank account at the central bank. And their bank account is reserves. And a bond just shifts the reserves from earning low interest to high interest. But the catch is they cannot cash in. They cannot withdraw money if they have their money in a bond. I can't do that either. If I were to buy a bond, I'll have to sit on that money until it matures. So if I buy a bond for like £100 and there's a 5% interest rate, and after like 3 months, I'll get back £105. Amongst currency users like us, it's a means of borrowing money. Amongst currency issuer, the term borrowing is completely inapplicable. It just drains reserves. Why do they do this? They have their reasons. They're pretty crap, but I won't go into them. I think we should stop issuing bonds. It just gives people who already have money, banks, more money in the form of high interest payments. A UBI for rich people. I don't think even people on the right would want that one. So, the main takeaway from this is that this is something that people on the left and on the right both get wrong. Is they say, we want to have Medicare for all, we want to have higher NHS spending, we want to have council houses. But the problem is, we can't afford it. We have to increase taxes to pay for it. And the right says, that's horrible, I don't want my tax rising. And the left will say, we have to go after Elon Musk, we have to go after Jeff Bezos. There are cash cows. If we can't tax them, we can't have socialism. Suddenly the left kind of puts an importance on billionaires to pay for everything. Well, it's completely wrong. We do not need their money at all. Elon Musk is less important than he thinks and than everyone else thinks. Okay, so key term government deficit is when taxation is greater than spending. That's the deficit. And everyone says the deficit is a horrible thing, it's unsustainable. Well, the problem is a government deficit is a private sector surplus. Because if we distinguish between a government sector and a private sector, if they're spending more on us, it means we are spending less on them. So that means the government deficit adds to the private sector savings. Think of surplus as a savings, to the penny. Their borrowing is our saving. So when Tories say we've got to reduce the deficit, what they're actually saying is we've got to reduce our private sector savings. And who in their right mind would advocate for that? You're just destroying private sector financial assets by sucking money out. A government surplus, that's all it does. It sucks money out of the private sector, which is us. Sorry, I got the arrows wrong here. The government surplus, it just sucks money out of the economy, and that reduces private sector surplus. It can bring us into a private sector deficit. A deficit for the private sector means that we are spending more than our income. Our income comes from the government, and we're spending more than that. How can we do that? Well, by borrowing money. It increases private sector debt, and this is what we saw in the lead up to the financial crash. We had more and more and more private sector debt building up. In America, they were like praising Bill Clinton, saying, good job at getting a budget surplus, that's so great. In reality, if you look at the sectoral accounting, and I've got a diagram here. I wish I could put this on the screen. It's too small for people to see. You can see that to the penny, when the government is in surplus, the private sector is in deficit. If the government is in deficit, the private sector is in surplus to the penny. So when the Tory says we've got to reduce the deficit, ask him, why do you want to put us into debt? Households, firms. Because if you look at it this way, the national debt that everyone keeps fear-mongering about is just the national private sector saving. It's fantastic for us. And we do not pay this back. They say if the national debt gets too high, we're going to have to, well, grandchildren will suffer the consequences with higher taxation. We're going to have to pay all of that off. Well, no. If you want to do interest payments on bonds, we just credit the accounts of the bondholders. We can do that as much as we like. We just need a guy with a finger at the central bank pressing buttons. If you don't have a guy with a finger, then we might be in trouble. I think we have plenty of things to go around. Yes, everyone have any questions? Please do ask.
And if you don't want to ask, we've also got the panel, which we'll go over at the end. It's just,
Just give that final bit at the end for the national debt and the national private sector saving. Just go over that bit.
Yeah, so the national debt is just the accumulation of all government deficits put together. So you put that together. Remember, they match every deficit by bond sales, which they call borrowing. Very inapplicable. So it's just the total amount of bonds in the economy, right? The total amount of net financial assets that people are sitting on. And that is savings. If you have money in a bond, that's your savings. So that's why the national debt is the national private sector saving to the penny, or the national non-government sector savings.
I have a
Yeah, so we got real resources. I'm talking in terms of financial
So the
assets.
government at some point must calculate that.
Yeah.
Like, it's not just pressing buttons, it's like thinking about.
Yeah, I'm talking about nominal savings, which is purely financial. Real savings are the real goods and services we have in the economy. Our infrastructure, the food, technology, it's backed by real products. But nominal savings is literally just that. And they can make as much of it as they want. Again,
So why
don't misinterpret this as saying we should just credit everyone's account by like $1 trillion and then we'll have so much savings and everything will be humpty-dory. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying there's no financial constraint and it's still better for us to have more income than we spend because that means we can have savings. Everyone wants to have savings. We don't want to indebt ourselves by maxing our credit cards. Let the government do that. Let the currency issuer, they can afford to do that. And mind you, we can divide the economy between government sector and non-government sector. We could also divide it in any way we want. Blue-haired people and non-blue-haired people. And their deficit equals the other person's surplus. We could do that. It'd be a useless distinction. The reason I'm doing it with government and non-government is because one's a currency issuer, one's not the currency issuer. That's why it's important. Every deficit, there's a surplus. For every borrower, there's a saver. Okay, so that was the basics of modern monetary theory. So we got the first part done. Next I'm going to talk about banking. How do banks work? Does anyone have a very basic idea? Like the very basic principle of banking. What is a bank?
Somewhere you put money in.
Something you put money in. Okay. Any idea?
Basically, they create money.
You create money. You're spoiling it. You come here, come on. So the basic idea of neoclassical banking, which is what most people I think how banking works, is that you put money in a bank, you put £100 in the bank, and then that bank lends out that £100. Well, it'll keep like £10 in reserves, and it'll loan out manually to somebody else who also has a bank account, and then they loan out, let's say, £81, and they keep like £10 in reserves. I had a diagram above this on my laptop, but obviously most people can't see it, so we're going to have to make do with it. And then they loan out that money, and you get in this endless spiral. It's called the money multiplier. So they keep like 10% in reserves. It could be any reserve requirement. They'll loan it out, the rest, and that finds itself into another bank account, and that bank loans that out. The basic idea is that your savings, the £100 put in, creates investment. This is completely false. Banks do not loan out your savings. Rather, investment creates savings. When you borrow money from a bank, the bank does not loan you out somebody's savings. The bank creates that loan out of thin air. say it's £100 loan. That's the bank's asset, because you overbank. The loan is your liability, because you overbank that money. Now your asset is the deposit that that loan creates. Because all of you guys took out tuition fee loan, right? You all took out a maintenance loan mostly. That's your bank deposit, isn't it? You use that loan to buy stuff. The loan creates the deposit. Loans create deposits. And that deposit is the bank's liability. Because the bank owes you cash. You can always go to an ATM machine to withdraw money. So as we can see, investment, when you borrow money to build a factory, to hire workers for investment projects, you take out a loan, that creates a savings. It's not savings that creates investment. Banks create loans out of thin air. So when they say, the government is borrowing scarce savings from banks, and then if the government keeps borrowing money, we won't have any money left in the bank for investment, for private sector investment. That's completely wrong. Investment loans are not a scarce resource. We can make as much of them as we like. So there's no crowding out private sector activity with higher government deficits. Okay, now here's something everyone has probably seen. So we're done with banking now. That was a very basic overview. Had a more detailed presentation on this a couple of weeks ago. Everyone's seen supply and demand diagrams, right? I mean, neoliberals love this. Demand, at a higher price, you're going to demand less of a good because it's expensive. As you lower and lower and lower the price, the quantity of output, we'll just call it quantity to make it easier, it increases. People buy more at lower prices. That's where demand slopes downwards, and at higher prices, firms supply more because it's more profitable to supply at higher prices. And more firms enter the market and they increase supply. And what we see is that the price we get at is an equilibrium, and then supply equals demand. So we have no excess supply. If the price was here, price was here, then people will only buy this much. If the price was here, firms will supply only this much. So that would be excess supply. Well, they say capitalism is efficient. This never happens. It cannot happen. That's where Say's law comes in. And I'll make a slightly different example. Labour market, where the same principle applies. Here, excess supply would be unemployment. We've got labour supply, we've got labour demand. Labour, people, us, we supply more labour at a higher increase the wage, we supply more labor. Why? Because leisure time becomes more expensive. If you're getting a higher wage, and if you want to have leisure time, that costs the wage that you could have earned. So it slopes upwards. Now, in reality, what they teach is bends backwards eventually, because once your wage is so high, you don't really need to work much more anymore, because you're already well off. But they assume that we're at this part of a West diagram doesn't work. Can't have that. In real life, the opposite is actually mostly true. And then there's labor demand. Labor demand derives from how productive a worker is. They say that as you increase the amount of workers you're hiring, let's say I have an oven and I keep adding more workers to the oven, each worker gets less productive. So I don't want to be paying higher and higher wages to those workers. I want to be paying lower and lower and lower wages to compensate for the lack of productivity. That's why it slopes downwards. At lower wage, they're going to hire more people. At a higher wage, we're going to hire less people. So again, we get this equilibrium. Or, I should mention, they're going to say that if you're on your labor demand curve, the wage you get is what you deserve. It's how productive you are. It's how much extra productivity you have to the firm. So if you're on low wages, starving, you fucking deserve it because you're unproductive. That's the mainstream philosophy behind this. It's pretty wrong, and that's why we need to tear it apart. Okay. Well, they say, look, if you're at wage 2, you got your excess supply, you got unemployment. So if you see unemployment, just lower the wage, and it will bring you back into equilibrium. And that was like the big idea in the Great Depression. They were like, wages are too high, we should lower them, and that will eliminate all the unemployment. Well, the problem is, wages are income. You use your wage money to spend. If wages are reduced, income is reduced. If income is reduced, this entire labor supply curve, demand curve, shifts to the left, because now they're selling less. If capitalists are selling less, they're going to start firing workers, because they're producing more than people are demanding, so they're going to cut back on production and they're going to start firing workers. So it actually has the opposite effect in a worst case scenario. At best, it does nothing. At best, wages, if you cut wages, it doesn't change anything. Another example of this is the paradox of thrift. They say if people want to have more savings, they should tighten the belts. If you're poor, you're probably spending like a drunken sailor, so save up more. Stop being such a spender. Everybody in the economy is doing bad. They should all start saving. The problem with that is if everyone starts saving, by definition, they're spending less. If they're spending less, that's less income for firms and workers. If there's less income in the economy, there's less saving. Because remember, income creates savings. A portion of every income you get, you save. Let's say you save 30% of every dollar you get. That's your marginal propensity to save. If your income goes down, that means your savings go down too. So if everybody started saving more in the economy, savings actually fall in the economy because income gets reduced. So there's a reverse effect. And this is what John Maynard Keynes pointed out. Like, labor demand and labor supply, they're not independent, they're interdependent. So we cannot have this equilibrium wage naturally occurring. There's no automatic market mechanism that can lead us in that. This is what Say's law was doing. So Kwaku mentioned John Baptiste Say, and Say came up with Say's law. He's a French economy from the 1700s. Neoclassical. What Say's law basically says is that supply creates its own demand. He says capitalists, they produce commodities, right? They make stuff to get money, only to buy other commodities. So all the income they get from supplying things, they just use it to buy other things. Supply creates its own demand. So there can never be excess supply, because everything you make will have a buyer, because it creates incomes for somebody to buy things with. All income is spent. So there cannot be any unemployment, because if everybody spends their income, there's no savings. Then capitalists are going to sell all the output, they're going to hire all the labor you need to produce that output, and we'll always have full employment. Now, Marx attacked this. Marx attacked this, Karl Marx. He says that this is false. In reality, the sequence is M, C, and prime. Capitalists start with money. They build their factories, they use their savings, or they use they borrow from a bank, or whatever. They use any amount of money to make commodities, to sell stuff, to make a profit, to get more money out at the end of it. They use money to get more money. They do not have to consume everything they get. Capitalists save, we save, workers save, everybody saves. If we save, that's unspent income, and unspent income leads to unemployment. If capitalists aren't selling, remember the circular flow of income. If savings leak money out of it, then firms will have to cut back on production, they'll have to fire workers, unemployment starts rising. And since nobody spends all their income in this economy, there's always people who save, and there's also money that gets taxed out, and there's money that's spent on imports. All that money goes out of the economy, there's unsold output, and we get unemployment. Marx said that capitalism has a natural tendency towards crisis. That's its natural state. There's no supply and demand automatic mechanism that ensures that equilibrium is reached at full employment. Now, say trying to get around this, a very familiar looking diagram. Call it a steady this. He said, okay, sure, people do save a portion of their income, but when they save, they only do so because they earn interest on savings. And interest is basically the reward for waiting. If they sit on that money, they can consume more in the future because you get more money out. If you save, you get more money out with interest, right? So that interest is the extra goods and services that they can consume in the future. And investment, so that's why it slopes up. The higher interest is, the more savings will increase. Because that's basically giving you more future consumption at a higher interest rate. And low interest rate investment decreases because then the cost of borrowing savings is high at high interest and at low interest, so that's why savings slopes down. It's more investment at low interest rates. So they equilibrate where savings equals investment. And then all your savings are basically invested. The interest rate is flexible enough to allow for that. Problem with this is, well, what it's saying is that when you do decide to save, that just signals to the firm that you want to consume in the future. So instead of making current goods and services, they'll start making investment goods and services. They'll start hiring workers at factories to produce capital equipment to make future goods. So in reality, all savings does, it shifts consumption from current goods to investment goods. So we still have unemployment, because now those workers are being hired in the investment sector instead. But that's how Say try to get around this. Well, this is when John Maynard Keynes comes in the 1930s, and he says, well, okay, let's say you capitalists get more optimistic, start investing. So on the classical theory, that just shifts the interest rate up and increases the supply of funds. The problem with that is investment is a component of income. So national income, we'll call it Y, this is GDP, it's consumption plus investment plus government spending plus export minus import. Investment is a component of national income. And remember what I said, a portion of every dollar is saved. So if investment increases, that increases savings. So the savings curve shifts. Again, this is interdependence. They don't work independently. So he says, well, interest rates don't determine savings. So loanable funds theory is completely wrong. He came up with liquidity preference. Liquidity preference is the idea that all the interest rate does is it redistributes money from liquid to illiquid assets. Liquid is closer to cash, illiquid is more like bonds. Because people save in financial terms. Remember, the classical economists, they completely ignore money. They don't believe it's important. They just think it's a veil. If you increase the amount of money in the economy, you're just going to get inflation. It doesn't change real output or employment. Well, Keynes says no, money is crucial. Because when people save, they do not signal intention to consume in the future. You could sit on cash on your mattress, and that doesn't signal to a capitalist anything. They do not know when you're going to order goods. So postponing consumption, but when are you going to order these future goods? They don't even know what you're going to be ordering in the future. So there's no signal being sent for future consumption when you save in liquid form. Liquid form, money, financial assets. So all the interest rate does, it just redistributes money, your savings from cash or bank deposits to like bonds or savings accounts or stocks. That's all it does. Instead, savings are a positive function of national income. So when the Tories start saying we have to save more as a society to increase savings, therefore we have to do austerity to tighten the belts, it's just fundamentally flawed. It contradicts basic accounting identities which are indisputable. Because these are the sources of funds. If you look at it, this is where money comes from, right? Investment, government spending, export money, these are the injections, these ones. Well, income can also be consumed, it can also be taxed, it can be saved, it can be spent on imports. Let me get rid of this to make it simpler. We can cross out the consumption on both sides. As we can see, import, savings, and tax equal the injections. If you want to have more of that, you've got to increase that. You have to either increase investment, government spending, or export in order to increase your savings, which is the opposite prescription of the Great Depression, where they were like, just lower wages, you will eliminate unemployment. Those pesky trade unions and those pesky minimum wages keeping unemployment high, well, it's completely wrong. Because higher wages might actually be a good thing for the economy, because higher wages means more spending. Workers tend to spend a higher proportion of their income than capitalists. capitalists tend to save more, workers tend to spend more. So if you actually increase wages, that would increase the demand for labor. The labor supply curve would actually shift that way, up. So Keynes proposed a new way of looking at employment and output determination. Keynes practically invented the field of macroeconomics. It didn't even exist before. They just thought at the micro level, what's true is true of the macro. So what Keynes proposed is D and Z curves. And it's summarized in a nice quote. Kwaku mentioned this earlier, pretty spot on as well. Capitalists will hire the amount of labor they think they will need to sell, the amount of output they think they will need to employ to sell the amount of output they think they can sell at a profit. All right. Capitalists will hire the amount of labor they think they will need to employ to sell the amount of output they think they can sell at the profit. So we got our Z curve, you can think of this as a supply curve, is the amount of labor you will need to hire a given amount of people. So at employment level 1, they need, let's say, 20 pounds of revenue, profit, however you want to look at it. And at employment level E2, they need 30. To hire this many people, they need this much spending in the economy. The D curve is how much they actually get, or how much they expect to get. So here, at E1, they need 20, but they get 60. It makes sense for them to increase employment. It makes sense for them to increase employment because they're getting more than they need until this point. Until this point, where the amount of money that they need equals the amount of money they get at that employment level. There is no reason whatsoever to presume that this is full employment. It just happens to be the state of effective demand in the economy. This is Keynes' biggest contribution, the notion of effective demand. Demand determines output and employment. As we can see, past this point here, they expect to get less than they actually need. So it makes sense for them to cut back on employment. This might not be the case. We might have overestimated or underestimated how much they get. There's a lot of, this diagram allows for a lot of uncertainty, which the other neoclassical diagrams ignore. It's all about capitalist expectations. If they expect to make more money, they'll hire more people. If they're optimistic, they'll invest. And investment increases demand even further. Remember the circular flow. So expectations and the state of effective demand determine output and employment. And I think we're almost done now. So the Keynesian labor market Keynesian labour market will look something like this. Labour supply. Capitalists do not have to increase the wage to hire more people. At a lower wage, we can even bring in the MMT contribution. At a lower wage, you cannot pay a tax liability, so workers will not work for something that would get them into jail anyway, or it's really a starvation wage. And capitalists don't have to raise wages to hire more people. The reason is that effective demand is too low. There's a high unemployment rate that keeps wages in check. Karl Marx called it a reserve army of the unemployed. If there's 5 job vacancies and there's 20 unemployed people competing for that job, the capitalist can be as picky as he wants. He does not have to increase the wage to hire you because everybody's thirsty for it. Except, of course, at the full employment level, then they will have to start increasing wages. Because if everybody has a job and a firm wants to hire you, it will have to offer you a higher wage than the other job does. And at that point, we'll start to see it more like the neoclassical model. But that's only past full employment. Now, labour demand looks more like this, a straight line. Some would even say it looks like this. But we'll just assume it's a straight line for now. Labour demand does not change with wages. If you increase wages, you'll actually get more demand. So it might even slope like this. But we'll assume that it's insensitive to wage changes. It might be here, which is way below full employment. So how do we move it there? Well, we have to increase demand. This is the point of effective demand. Now, how do we shift demand to full employment? Well, we have to fill the demand gap created by savings, imports, and taxes. How do we fill that demand gap? Well, investment expenditure could do it, but if capitalists are pessimistic, they're not going to invest. We could have exports to do it. Well, the problem with export is, what if the rest of the world doesn't want your stuff? We can't control that, really, can we? So, the main tool is fiscal policy, which is government spending and taxation. Fiscal policy can close the demand gap. That's government spending and taxation. So when we see unemployment in a society, that is evidence that the deficit is too small. We have to spend more to fill the demand gap. Now, of course, that doesn't mean any kind of spending. Some spending is better than other spending. You could have some inflationary pressures below full employment if you spend where wages are just being paid up. In the Keynesian days, they used to do pump priming methods, where they just say, okay, we'll get to full employment using infrastructure spending. And it worked to some degree. Well, a lot of the time what you do is you hire these construction workers who are highly skilled, you're just bidding their wages up. Well, so they're still unemployed people. Well, you're not hiring. So the best way to just completely kill the unemployment problem would be a job guarantee program. Where anyone willing and able to work can get a job, would be guaranteed a job at a wage, and the wage is a political choice. In America, they're pushing for $15 an hour. Around here, I think people would be like, what are most people pushing for these days? Like 10, 12 pounds?
Yeah, well or more even.
The current minimum wage is like the 21-year-olds.
£8.63.
£8. Yeah, so I think £12 would be a great.
That's about the living. That's like the living wage or something.
Yeah. I think this could be, I mean, it could be any wage we offer choosing. We could sell with £12 an hour, and that would be the minimum wage basically. Because if capitalists pay you below £12 an hour, you'll be like, what are you doing? I'll just go there instead. So they have to offer you a higher wage. It returns bargaining power to all of us, like we had in the 60s and 70s. And of course, unemployment is cured, because now everyone has a job. There are many other benefits of job guarantee, like it stabilizes inflation. We do not have time to go into that at all, unfortunately. But it's probably the most important policy I can possibly think of. There's nothing quite as important as a job guarantee program. because it addresses the low wages community, it addresses unemployment, and indirectly it will reduce poverty, inequality, and see a much more equitable society built for people, not, well, whoever it's built for now, billionaires, I guess. So I think it's not. Oh yes, so they had this in Argentina for like a short period. So Argentina had the worst economy ever. It was horrible. But then around 2003, they implemented a job guarantee, and suddenly, like, hey, we're looking at GDP figures from down there, and suddenly it spiked up. So the change is pretty drastic. And when they dropped the job guarantee program, it went right back down to a bad economy. So yeah, job guarantee, push for this policy, lobby politicians, we need it. And we'll have an event in the future on just the job guarantee, looking into detail into how this stabilizes the economy, both inflation and unemployment and wages. But I think I'll stop here. There's a point that Harvey wants to make in regards to the strikes.
Yeah.
So
We move back to that's going to be so much quicker. But yeah, so you know, ultimately, we are well-being economic society. And I mean, personally myself, I didn't know what that particularly meant. I didn't know what economics meant. You know, Abdullah was the person who, again, gave me insight into that. But well-being economics is, realistically, looking at changing these. So again, what Abdullah's saying, bringing in things like a job guarantee. It's looking at, it's an umbrella term for looking at ways where we can shift the economy and the economic system that we choose in order to make it more centered on, I suppose, the person or the people, even. So with things like a job guarantee. So in that way, we're divvying out more power to the social surrounding of society, to the people who are involved in that, the people who keep society turning, and re-giving power. So I wanted to take just a bit of time to actually link this back to, well, partially the reason we're here is, you know, we're during some quite important strikes for staff. And I wanted to bring that point back, particularly to wellbeing economics. So how I'm going to do that is I'm going to address the strike demands and then say how these could potentially change if we were to shift to a more wellbeing economy. I use an example of donut economics but not more like general policies. So the policies that could be implemented in order to address the strike demands. So the first one that I found was equal pay, and that's across gender, ethnicity, and disabilities. So everyone receiving the same pay. So the current D for demand. The current economy. Well, apparently there's a meeting today about what the uni's going to do. But so far we've heard nothing. There's nothing. Is there a way to try and solve that at the moment? Honestly, in certain places, but it seems more individual, down to the employer. There's no kind of widespread idea. But if we were to respond to that, there's a few things we can do. So initially, so we would look to create an economy that's designed by and for those impacted by these issues. So Denisha Killer, who is she's one of the main, she's really closely involved with wellbeing economics. She stresses the need to build a wellbeing economy that is meaningfully designed by and for those communities that are most impacted and marginalised by the current system, meaning pay and discrimination would be eliminated because the source of such discrimination would no longer exist, because it's no longer it would be no longer a system which is based around white male head of chain. You know, it would then change to a more diverse source, and therefore would be able to remove these ideas of pay discrimination. So that's quite long to write down, so I'm just not going to write that down. So then the next aspect of the strike was about casual contracts and other kind of precarious work employment. So yeah, the precarious employment practices. So not only does wellbeing economics focus on ensuring a job security, so with Abdullah saying about the job guarantee, so there's a focus on this ensuring of a job, but wellbeing economics also takes on this humanistic paradigm, which is an approach to work, basically simply meaning that it stresses the importance of the person and the feelings of that person, the things that are important to a human as an individual, because no one works their whole life. No one works and does nothing else. You don't wake up, work, go to sleep. There are other parts of your life, and wellbeing economics wants to look into that. So within this paradigm, it sees the importance of care, human dignity, and community in a working environment, and therefore it attempts to have significantly less precarious contracts in areas such like teaching, because it's an important aspect of life, it's a massively important role to play. So to have more fixed contracts and more guaranteed jobs would be something that wellbeing economics would stand for and would advocate for. And again, a full employment policy ensuring everyone who wants a job is guaranteed one at a living wage, very important, would also bring an end to these casual contracts and job scarcity. The next point I could find was unsafe workloads. And to my mind, this took on a kind of mental health aspect. So not necessarily that teachers are being asked to climb really tall ladders in that what they're doing is unsafe, but the amount of work they're being given to do and the amount of stress and time pressure they're put under is unsafe. So to answer that, firstly, wellbeing economics doesn't just see GDP. It doesn't just see money coming in, and ultimately, the way university has transformed over the years has become very much a money system. I mean, they used to have free education, and it's changed again. So GDP is seen by wellbeing economics as an outdated term. It's something that needs to change. It only counts those transactions that happens, and it doesn't consider, again, what's important to the person. So for wellbeing economics, we want to understand that the other factors around, aside from money, or what money can be used towards that isn't capital or not, it is towards investment, but not like infrastructure, I suppose. So, for example, with donor economics, there's a social foundation of several factors, which is crucial. And these factors are health, food, water, energy, education, networks, housing, gender equality, social equality, political voice, peace and justice, and income and work. If any of these is unstable within a donor economy, it's considered a shortfall and is addressed. And whereas if we look to a current society, that may not be the case. Certain things can lapse and fall back, but they might not be addressed, or may not be addressed for a while. For example, homelessness. Many people, may know someone who is affected by it, and if not, it's certainly easy to see those who are affected by it. In a donor economy, this would be addressed so that housing, as it's a social foundation, would be allocated and accounted for in a multitude of ways. One, through the job guarantee, so people would be able to afford housing. So then, the stress of health with one of these foundations is not just physical, but it's mental health as well. So with this, there would be an application for self-care and flexible workloads to account for the abilities of the person, not for the corporate. So not how much the work they work can give out, but it's how much works an individual can process to then give out. And that's the more important part. So going back to supplying a living wage, which would also be helpful for these, the workloads people can then afford. So the work they do, like Abdullah said, the current idea is what you get is what you deserve. Actually, having a fairer working wage or a fairer living wage is then rewarding to the person for doing what they can, to what they can contribute in their workload, again, making it more about to the person. And the living wage will also return the bargaining power, again, like Abdullah mentioned as well, to create a fairer pay and fairer working conditions, again, eliminating this unsafe workload. And with what I mentioned to reducing other issues, with a living wage, the wage is not only matched to the price of society, but in a well-being economy, the price of society could be altered to match the living wage. Although it might take certain things to do with housing prices and healthcare could be altered so that they're more accessible to those within their work. And then finally, the final point was about pension cuts. And now for this one, I was stunned a little bit. I wasn't too sure to begin with, but then having done some research, I found a few ideas. So a well-being economy at its basis argues that, well, I mean, as one of its bases, argues that good lives in retirement are not just defined by economic wealth. And other important human needs such as dignity, connection and fairness and participation should also be recognised. And it sees that the current pension schemes in many countries are unsustainable and dysfunctional. And which has probably been the reason for so many cuts, is because they aren't sustainable, that people are having to take back what they give out because it's not working. So with that, a well-being economy, in a well-being economy, people should receive their pensions in a healthy and thriving planet community, so that the needs of the pensions are met in the long term. So this would look at fixing the root of the problem, rather than just putting more into pension schemes. It would look at why they're unsustainable, why they are dysfunctional, and look into how wages can be, how a pension can be considered for everything it's going to cover in retirement, not just food and water and shelter. It's more than. So it looks at investing in infrastructure, in technologies and natural restorations that will lead to a fulfilling retirement. Because after all, what good is a higher pension in a dead environment? And the one thing I just wanted to end on was Anna Fielding, who's the chair of the Economic Change Unit and a specialist in economic systems change and leadership for social and environmental justice. And she says that well-being economics is an idea and a movement that means the elite could no longer monopolise resources and power at the expense of everyone else. That makes it a dangerous idea, which is why